Let me introduce session 2 of the 2023 Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Forum. The title of the article is Destroying the Pious Monster, the Collapse of the U.S. Indian Factory. And it's presented by James C. Auld. He's no stranger to the Fur Trade Journal. He's written several articles in the past. He's an author and fur trade historian who campaigns for political and social justice. He's been a frequent contributor and peer reviewer for the journal. He's been invited to participate in numerous documentaries since 2005. From 2012 to 2014, he was the executive producer of the Museum of the Mountain Man's Three Worlds Meet project, where historical interpreters, scholars, and indigenous people brought to life the art of Alfred Jacob Miller by performing tableaux vivants in Pinedale, Wyoming. They also went to Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and at Merthyr Castle in Scotland, which was the ancestral home of William Drummond Stewart. So without further ado, here is Mr. James C. Auld.
Welcome. Thanks for coming. Your presence here helps make this journal kind of come alive. I want to single out a special thanks to the peer reviewers. Without the element of academic scrutiny and the articles published in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal every year wouldn't really have the same authority of accuracy or scholastic depth. So, thank you. That's good, thanks. There's a lot of material out there to read regarding the Rocky Mountain fur trade, and one should be careful what one reads and what one believes. As we can see in the last program, if you quote one author from a book 10 years later after the book's been published, it may not still be accurate. So I'm going to assume that all of you are not familiar with the term United States Indian Factory System. I can tell you that I was not aware of the term the United States Indian Factory System until I read an excellent article by Dr. Brad Tennant that was published in the 2008 Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Volume 2, out of print right now. But that was the first I had heard of the United States Indian Factory System, and it really got my interest up and running. And I've been researching this topic since about 2010. I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about factories. Now, you know, not the kind of factories that we're familiar with, where people build cars and make computer chips and create frozen tater tots. But these are places where things are manufactured and constructed and assembled, usually by machines for a wholesale market. And since this is such a big story that can't really be told in just 30 minutes, I want to share today with you 3 basic ideas. I want to talk about the background of the founding of the factory system, and I want to talk about the description of one of the factories that had a connection with the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. And I also want to close with a brief account of how the factory system ended, which is really what interested me all along, is the way that the factory system was a government-sponsored program, and it was fairly successful, and it grew up to 28 different factories around the United States. But the private traders really felt left out of it. And so they spent a lot of time and money of John Jacob Astor's money to fight the system. And in the end, they ended up closing it down. So that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of what happened here. So decades before the Rendezvous era was established by Andrew Henry and William Ashley in the Rocky Mountains, the United States government created a federal program to control trade with the indigenous people living throughout the wilderness of America's new boundaries. These merchandising hubs were operated by federal agents called factors, and the trading houses where they worked were known as factories. The first of these was created in 1796 by President George Washington, who, along with the next 4 presidents, supported legislation to finance and administer the U.S. Indian factory system. From its inception, this program had both ardent supporters and diehard opponents. Some critics characterized these factories as a government monopoly, driving business away from private traders, small partnerships, and larger enterprises. Others defended them as necessary outreach policies to manage trade with the indigenous people, assimilating them to become civilized, teaching them domestic arts and the skills of art agriculture. The program was in force until 1822. Over the 26 years of its existence, 28 factories were established. On September 3rd, 1783, the American Revolution against Great Britain ended. The Treaty of Paris halted the conflict between the two combatants, resulting in Great Britain surrendering the land it believed was theirs to the United States. The agreement conferred all British rights to the area east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of the then undetermined line between Canada and the United States. Here's a slide I want to show with you, as I mentioned earlier, showing the example of a political cartoon from a British newspaper, the London Times, dated 1783, as you can see on the bottom. This type of political cartoon has been a great source of amusement for me over the years. I find it interesting how a drawing can illustrate a political commentary where an editorial narrative sometimes falls short. This cartoon is about the Treaty of Paris, where Great Britain acknowledged American independence, represented by a map labeled America. And that is being carried off by the devil while he's farting and saying, "John Bull, ha ha." And they actually draw a little fart coming out of the devil's behind there. So John Bull, representing Great Britain, is throwing up his arms in despair as he is teased by a Frenchman who's offering him snuff. A Spaniard gestures down to the Rock of Gibraltar where there's naval activities going on. And to the left, this ill-dressed Dutchman comments something about paying the piper. So no evidence indicates that indigenous people were represented at the negotiations at the Treaty of Paris, or even asked what they thought about the arrangement. And yet, this was the starting point of their relations with the new nation for decades to follow. By signing this first international treaty, the victor of the war, the American government, claimed dominion over people, land, animals, water, and sky across a vast geography, doubling the area of the original 13 colonies. With the support of President Washington, the Trading House Act of 1796 created a federal system funded with $150,000 of capital stock. And it authorized Washington to establish trading houses and appoint an agent at such posts and places on the western and southern frontiers or in Indian country for the purpose of carrying on a liberal trade with the several Indian nations within the limits of the United States. Section 4 of this Trading House Act stipulated that the price of the goods purchased and then traded to the Indians would be regulated so that the capital stock furnished by the United States may not be diminished. And this became a difficult part of the legislative mandate to control, for it assumed that the price paid for the trade goods, $150,000, would not exceed the value of the furs, skins, and hides that were brought into the trading stations. As you can see, the earliest factories were founded mostly in the South and in the old Northwest Territories, north of the Ohio River, some before statehood was established. The westernmost factory of the program was Fort Osage, founded in 1808 and named after the Great and Little Osage nations whose lands were located east of present-day Kansas City. Virtually every exploring party and trapping brigade going west out of St. Louis during this era went past the site of Fort Osage as they pushed upriver into the mountains. The primary success of Fort Osage as an Indian factory resulted from its geographic location and its responsible management practices. When the Lewis and Clark expedition returned from the Pacific Ocean to St. Louis in 1806, William Clark was appointed Indian agent and soon chose a site and made plans for a military fort to be built on the right bank of the Missouri River below the mouth of the Little Blue River near present-day Sibley, Missouri. Clark's decision was based on previous observations of the terrain and knowledge of the indigenous people who lived there. Clark led a U.S. Army battalion dubbed the Western Dragoons overland to the building site with a military show of magnitude not seen before west of the Mississippi. They arrived on Sunday, September 4th, 1808, to begin building the garrison. Forthwith, Clark assembled the two Osage tribes 10 days later, and on September 14th, created a treaty. As you can see on this copy of the William Clark map, the Missouri River comes in from the upper right corner, flowing past the site of the fort. So Missouri River is written upside down, but here's the river coming down here, and these are all the different ways that the current reacts to it. The next slide shows the factory in a recent photograph taken from the sharp point of land on the center of that image. So this is the reconstruction you can go to these days and see. This is the Fort Clark, and next to it is the Fort Osage factory. Here's an image of an Osage chief named Le Soldat du Chien, who witnessed the signing of the treaty. This is from a painting by a famous 19th century artist, Charles Bird King. Within 3 weeks after signing the treaty, the U.S. factory system facilities were under construction alongside Fort Clark. The first factor at Fort Clark was George Chaplin Sibley. He began his duties by supervising the transfer of merchandise from the former Fort Bellefontaine factory to the newly founded Fort Osage using 4 keel boats provided by the U.S. Army. At the start of 1809, the factory was furnished and operations were underway. At this point, Ramsey Crooks, one of the main characters of the factory system's eventual demise, enters this story. Crooks was a Scot by birth. He witnessed the fur trade firsthand as an apprentice in the mercantile markets of Montreal and later on the waters and portages of the Great Lakes. He learned the skills of a trapper and the cleverness of a trader before he was 20 years old. By 1807, he had arrived in St. Louis and within 2 years had organized a trade venture up the Missouri River that ultimately failed, but the lessons gained from the enterprise helped prepare him for the next 50 years of an astonishing career. Ramsey Crooks is perhaps best known by people that study the things we study for his grueling journey of starting in 1810 with Wilson Price Hunt, leader of the Astorian venture, from St. Louis, Missouri to the mouth of the Columbia River at the Pacific Ocean, and their subsequent return to St. Louis. A chronicled accomplishment of the returning eastbound adventurers was the first effective use of what has become known as South Pass, traversed by Crooks and his party in 1812 on their return to the settlements. Here is a painting by John Clymer titled Survival that illustrates the journal entry of October 14th, 1812, when the starving eastbound Astorians came upon something they could eat. The text from a journal entry written by their leader, Robert Stewart, describes how the party discovered an old rundown buffalo bull, which after considerable trouble, we succeeded in killing about 2 p.m. And so ravenous were our appetites that we ate part of the animal raw. This scene involves Ramsey Crooks is probably one of those people, undoubtedly, and it happened not too far away from here. So Crooks returned to St. Louis in 1813 and continued to work for the American Fur Company, eventually acting as general manager of fur trade operations at Fort Mackinac, headquarters located on Mackinac Island in Lake Huron in present-day state of Michigan. The War of 1812 brought years of decline to American interests in the Pacific and the Missouri River and the factory system altogether. Crooks' business plan was to crush the factory system out of existence. He intended to put into motion a scheme to build a vast network of private trading establishments, all operated by the American Fur Company, whose owner was John Jacob Astor. The remainder of this story centers on the city of Washington, D.C. shown here in a painting by George Cook titled City of Washington. If any of you are familiar with the geography or the topography of Washington, D.C., this is the cover splash page for the article. And I'm sure things would look familiar to you if you're familiar with Washington. By 1821, Crook's campaign to defund the factory system relied on his ability to lobby several senators and congressional representatives, including friend and fellow collaborator, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. The resulting debates and speeches and tirades and printed broadsides against the factories were published in numerous influential national and regional newspapers. Ramsey Crook's primary rival for the continuance of the factory system was Thomas L. McKinney. Into this bureaucratic maelstrom stepped a new superintendent of Indian trade, Thomas Loraine McKinney. His experience in storekeeping and an education in natural history, especially mineralogy, were sufficient to qualify him for assignment by President James Madison on April 12, 1816. By 1818, there was intense pressure by private traders and anti-factory capitalists determined to end the factory system. One of McKinney's responses to this threat was to unite with his superior, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, and others, including certain members of Congress who were agreeable to defending the factories and the humanitarian causes attributed to the mandate. As soon as McKinney became superintendent, Calhoun quickly leaned heavily on him for advice on how to deal with the intercourse between a civilized and savage people. McKinney's prime solution was to activate the missionaries who supported Indian reform. This proved moderately successful for a short time, and Calhoun benefited from the perception that he himself was a reformer. The years between 1818 and 1822 exhibit a dizzying array of national issues that produced dire consequences for the U.S. Indian factory system. In January 1818, Ramsey Crooks and colleague Robert Stewart wrote a letter to Astor in which they laid out their plans to end the factories. They were alarmed by the belligerent attitude of the government trading houses. They wrote, quote, "The factories have become so numerous and are of late provided with such extensive means as to threaten in a very few years more to annihilate private competition and to throw the whole trade into the hands of the government." This letter caused Crooks to go to Washington City to lobby on behalf of the factory system's destruction. And so, although the factory system continued to grow despite its critics and its lack of requested federal funding, the system was on trial for its very existence. Superintendent McKinney supported several bills to expand the factories, but they were twice rejected by the House Committee on Indian Affairs and delayed for 2 years. The opposition of powerful private traders and their influence on Congress, as well as some unfavorable reports of territorial governors, all foreshadowed its downfall. Publishing newspapers, private letters, and congressional testimony was a standard practice at this time to influence public opinion. Politicians used newspapers to further their own agenda. These public editorials played a significant role in both the opinion-bending propaganda of the day and the historic record by which these events are studied by today's scholars. Thomas McKinney and his supporters favored a system that would introduce religion, cultural assimilation, abstinence from alcohol, and those things into the relationship between the government and indigenous people. They also supported the creation of more trading establishments, more federal agents, and more factors who would bring to bear additional regulations on private traders. McKinney lobbied missionary societies, and Calhoun, warning of the evils of alcohol and the need for spiritual learning through religious-based schools. The other side of the debate supported private traders and opposed regulations that limited their independent behavior toward indigenous people they encountered. The private traders would do as they wished marrying trading partners' daughters to enhance their social status, and use alcohol as liberally as they could to gain an advantage in trading transactions. It would have been difficult to avoid hearing arguments in the nation's capital surrounding the future of indigenous people of America during these years between 1820 and 1822. In February 1821, a broadside appeared in the Washington Gazette with the headline, "The Indian Trade." The published letter is unrestrained in its criticism of the U.S. Indian factory system, its agents, factors, and director, Thomas McKinney. The diatribe is addressed to him personally and attacked McKinney in language meant to leave little doubt in the imagination of the reader. Crooks was the presumed author, began by answering McKinney's earlier report to Congress and questioning the financial metrics of the system. Blaming McKinney for mismanagement, McKinney was accused of blaming the private traders with running wild through the woods with little or any character and without any efficient check on their proceedings. The article is signed "The Backwoodsman." So the U.S. Indian factory system twisted in the wind for over a year as legislation to end it was delayed and then reintroduced with more legislative support 1 year later. One of the final indications that the legislation would pass both houses of Congress was the retirement of Congressman Henry Southard, one of McKinney's most loyal supporters. The bill abolishing the government trading houses became law on March 31st, 1821, but a year was allowed for the winding up of the business. And in a very acrimonious gesture, Senator Benton forced through a supplementary act on May 6, 1822, that provided that the task of winding up would be entrusted not to the present incumbents, but to agents especially appointed for this purpose. Here's a view of the old House of Representatives painted by Samuel Morse. This was the site of many debates regarding the factory system. The factories were to be discontinued on June 3rd, 1822. As part of the winding up process, auctions were held at various cities around the country. Here is a broadside from an auction to be held in Detroit. The journal article has a full page of this document on page 136, if you're interested. So the demise of governmental control of the Indian trade opened the way for private enterprise to scour the icy streams of the Rocky Mountain West for beaver and other valuable furs, unhindered by strict federal regulations. Determined efforts by Ramsey Crooks and others created new economic opportunities for the private fur traders on the American frontier. Within a year of its collapse, Crooks wrote a letter to Benton congratulating him for the work he did to hasten the demise of the factories, emphasizing the support given to the system by missionaries, which both Crooks and Benton despised. On April 1st, 1823, Ramsey Crooks wrote to Thomas Hart Benton, quote, "I have been honored this morning with your favor last Friday to hasten and congratulate you on your decisive victory. The result is the best possible proof of the value in the country of talents, intelligence, and perseverance, and you deserve the unqualified thanks of the community for destroying the pious monster. Since to your unwearied exertions and sound practical knowledge of the whole subject, the country is indebted for its deliverance from so gross and unholy an imposition." So I made an extensive online search for any other political cartoons from this period that might have related to the U.S. Indian factory system, but not being able to find one, I decided to make up my own. And with the help of my friend Mark Kelly and Carol Kuhn, I offer this as an example of what we're looking at. In the left, we have upper left, the Capitol with John Jacob Astor and Ramsey Crooks. On the right, we have photo stage with George C. Sibley and a different Native American, Wati Anka. On the lower left, we have Senator Thomas Hart Benton throwing a pen through the heart of the pious monster. And over here, Thomas McKinney falling to his knees, almost shouting, "No, no, don't destroy the factory system." So this Next slide shows what happens if you start searching online for the factory system. The person who took from this office without permission a pamphlet on the factory system and Indian Affairs is requested to return it immediately. That's the way people were publicly shamed in those days. That's the end of my talk. I'll take any questions if you have any.